Welcome to the conversation with Geoffrey Hodgson. My name is Pavel Kuchar. Geoffrey Hodgson is a professor in management at the Loughborough University of London and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Institutional Economics. Today we are discussing the question of how economics forgot history. Can I ask you to briefly introduce what historicism is about and how is it that economists might have forgotten history?
Yes, thank you, Pavel, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. The historical school started in Germany around about the 1840s. It was very important then because Germany had a more highly developed education system at the university level than many other, in fact, most other countries at that time. So this was implanted into a newly developing university system in Germany before even Germany was unified, and had huge influence over the social sciences. The German Historical School lasted from the 1840s until the Nazi period, until Germany was defeated. Germany, first of all, became taken over by the Nazi Party in 1933 and was defeated, of course, in the Second World War. Remnants of it still survive, but that's the period. It's lasted for a century. Its history and its ideology reflect the concerns at the time that Germany was a developing country, and people engaged in economic policy in Germany wanted to follow or catch up with Britain, which was rapidly industrializing at the time. But they were critical of British policy. Adam Smith was interpreted as being too laissez-faire, too reliant on markets, although Smith himself is more complex than that. But that was the prevailing interpretation in Germany. And there were various strands of thinking coming together in the German Historical School, which challenged what they called English or British classical economics at the time. Particularly in policy terms, its reliance on markets with a minimal state intervention. But it wasn't simply policy, it was also theory that drove them. They developed the key point that economic systems change through time. So economics as a science, or ostensibly a science, has to address a changing subject matter. This makes economics similar to biology because biological species come into being and they evolve. So the subject matter of biology changes through time, over a long period at least. But it contrasts it with, say, physics, because physics faces up to the nature of matter and ostensibly develops key laws and principles like Newtonian principles or Einstein's theory, which are meant to be true for all time. They're meant to be relevant to the subject matter of the nature of the material world throughout history. So economics has this special problem, which it shares with biology, of a changing subject matter. And so contrary to some arguments that have been put before, there was a move away from universal principles of political economy. So the so-called laws of supply and demand, which some economists have talked about already before Smith, these so-called laws were said to be context-specific. They depended on the existence of property rights and development. Not always been the case. So the German Historical School made a theoretical critique of what they saw as prevailing classical economics at the time, particularly influenced by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. So the general problem, which I call the problem of historical specificity, was central to the German historical school thought. But the way they tackled this problem changed dramatically over the 100 years of that school's existence. The German historical school also spread to other countries. Its influence spread way beyond Germany to many other countries, including the United States, Britain, even Japan and China to some extent had social scientists who were influenced by the German historical school. We're going to talk about Cliff Leslie in a minute, and he was part of a group of Irish economists who were influenced by the German historical school. And these Irish economists were the first implantation, the first core influence of the German historical school in the British Isles. Some of them moved to London physically and played a part in the development of economics during the 19th century, influencing people like John Stuart Mill and others, and also later, importantly, Alfred Marshall. Marshall's position on German historical school thinking is often misstated, misquoted. He was far more sympathetic than some commentators argue. I show that in my book, that his degree of sympathy was quite extensive. Right. He didn't deny the importance of universal principles, but at the same time he accepted the problem of historical specificity being relevant and drew the conclusion from that that a great deal of empirical work has to be done always within economics to establish the relevance or veracity of certain core principles in particular contexts.
Excellent. Thank you. This is a very good introduction, and it is interesting that the German historical school, which is known, has its counterpart in the United Kingdom and in the English-speaking world. And you mentioned some of the Irish economists who are also criticizing some of the laws and the universalism or alleged supposed universalism of economic theory. And I think it is interesting to find that this discussion reaches people like Jevons, for instance, also talks about them. I have a quote from The Theory of Political Economy by Jevons, who was one of the representatives of the so-called marginalist revolution in the English-speaking world. And in the preface of that book, Jevons points out that there was a discussion, a remarkable discussion that's been going on in the reviews and journals, I'm quoting here, concerning the logical method. So this is a discussion about methodology, and touching even the question whether there exists any such science at all. And he mentions that attention was drawn to the matter by Mr. Cliff Leslie and his remarkable article on the philosophical method of political economy. He also mentions a couple of other economists who tend to be critical, like Thornton or Ingram. And it is interesting that he continues saying that a spirit of a very active criticism then is spreading, which can hardly fail to overcome in the end the prestige of the false old doctrines. But then what do we put in place of them? Asks Jevons. At the best, it must be allowed that the fall of the old Orthodox creed will leave a chaos of diverse opinions. And many would be glad if the supposed science collapsed altogether and became a matter of history. Perhaps Cliff Leslie would not go so far as this. So this is quite an interesting discussion that brings our attention to these thinkers, like Cliff Leslie, who unfortunately passed away quite young, but also the other representatives of the historical school in Britain, like Reverend Richard Jones, who I believe was the first professor of political economy at King's College London, or John Kels Ingram, or later Walter Bagehot. So why don't we look at what is the argument of Clive Leslie against the universalism or the method of classical political economy? Jevons mentions the essay on philosophical method that Leslie wrote. What was his reasoning behind the criticism? You have mentioned that when the subject matter of economics changes through time, then the science also has to change through time. What are some points of Leslie that he would make to that respect?
Yes, in that respect, he was repeating the arguments of foreigners, including the early members of the German Historical School, and also other Irish writers at that time who complained about the approach of the British government and its use of what was then called political economy for forms of really non-intervention in the Irish potato famine. The Irish potato famine in the 1840s led to the deaths of about 1 million people and the emigration of another million, and this devastated Ireland for decades afterwards. And the Irish political economists argued that the institutions in Ireland were not were different from the institutions in a developed market economy, and consequently they could not rely on the standard recipes which might apply in a market economy to deal with the problems in Ireland. And there was particularly the issue of the form of contract or agreement between the Irish tenant farmers and the landlords,
right,
many of which were English, and the idea that they couldn't help because everything was a agreed contract, everything was done and dusted under some legal contracting system, whereas in fact the Irish system was much more dominated by culture and by tradition and by other considerations rather than simply legal contract. So the arguments for non-intervention were based on the difference of the institutions that one found in Ireland at the time. But Leslie actually went further than these particular criticisms. He argued in a very eloquent, particularly eloquent way for recognition of the particularity of phases of historical development, but he also, unlike some of his predecessors, emphasized some theoretical issues concerning the limitation of all economic theory. He emphasized the complexity of economic systems, and he emphasized the uncertainty that agents face when dealing with analytical and practical problems in economies.
Right. I find the idea of stages development being quite prominent in Leslie's reasoning, and in that sense, I find him to be continuing the line of thinking found in people like Adam Smith, for instance, where and he praises him for his sort of historical and inductive mind in that sense. And I was putting here on the screen, there is on page 227 in his essay, the thesis that it is only by historical investigation we can understand how the whole economy and its long evolution and the continuity of that evolution develops. And the laws at the bottom of the page, of which it is the result, must be sought in history. The general laws of society and social evolution are basically historical. And what you mentioned is that there is this succession of these stages of development, and again, they coincide with what Adam Smith talks about, the hunting, pastoral, agricultural, and commercial states that are referred to the economic development. And that social evolution and the economical side of which is indissolubly connected with its moral and intellectual and political side. So there is this complexity of the economic theory, which depends on the stage of development of a country, of a nation. And it is quite interesting that this perspective comes from a place like Ireland towards the laws and economic theories coming from London and from the London Political Economy Club and people like Ricardo. I think
yes, absolutely. That's right. I mean, as you've also mentioned Richard Jones,
yeah,
who was I'm not sure he was a professor at the East India College.
I think that's right. I think
But he wasn't the first professor. Malthus was. He was Malthus's replacement.
He replaced Malthus, I think, at the East India College. But I think before that, his first appointment was, in fact, the chair of political economy at King's College.
Oh, okay.
And then he moved on to replace Malthus at the East India College.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, obviously, this was the college set in Hertfordshire. The buildings still survive, where they trained civil servants for the East India Company, including economists that would advise them. And that's the roles that Malthus and Jones played. So you have the context of trying to understand what was different about India. So it's also another input here with Jones is the consideration of a very different society, organized in terms of caste, with different traditions, quite remote, which the British had to deal with in their imperial venture to dominate in India. So they had to learn about customary law in India, all the particular historical conditions, the institutions and cultural norms. All that stuff was relevant to this training for people to be sent to administer India. So there's both of these inputs. There's a huge cataclysm, the tragedy of the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, combined with a recognition that economists engaged in practical matters, particularly in parts of the British Empire, would have to deal with very different circumstances.
Right. I think this is quite an interesting insight into, for instance, contemporary development economics. If we still continue reading Leslie on this page, you can see that he makes it clear based on these experiences that you have just mentioned, the Irish potato famine, but then also dealing with the Indian world, Indian culture, the Indian institutions and habits. You have a society which is at a different stage of development in that sense, and to each of these successive states would continue, Leslie, there is a corresponding moral and intellectual condition with a corresponding polity, and then we can also say with a corresponding science that corresponds to it. And at the bottom of this page, quite interestingly, you mentioned the importance of status and really the unimportance of contractual arrangement in dealing with land tenure and land market in essence. Leslie would say the successive evolution of the hunting and pastoral and agricultural and commercial states is intimately connected with the movement from status to contract, right? So it seems that this is something that is already complete in England, but yet to be completed in other parts of the world, like Ireland, like India, but like many other economies that have not went as far as the English economy in developing its markets. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely right. Yes, I mean Main's argument was very influential at the time. It captures this important point about the historical specificity of a contract system.
Right.
Although we would want to add a lot more to what Main says in the light of more recent research, but nevertheless, that's a relevant point which was taken on board.
So there is this criticism in Leslie of what he calls the abstract and a priori method, which is something that we can find, for instance, on page 241 in his essay. And he would say that the abstract and a priori method yields no explanation of the laws. So he would be
talking about the law of rent, for instance, determining either the nature or the amount or the distribution of wealth. So that seems to be also the criticism of John Stuart Mill, not only Ricardo. And on the other hand, he would say the philosophical method must be then based in history, not in abstract a priori and deductive reasoning. We must connect the economical and the other phases of national history. Can we say something about that criticism of people like Ricardo and Mill? And why is it that, for instance, Jevons opposes that criticism, saying that, well, if we get rid of the abstract and a priori method, what is then left? What are we left with?
Yeah, this is a very important point, I think. I mean, and it's a point which, an issue which was discussed continually during the 100 years.
It is with us until today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's relevant today. But I mean, during the historical school period itself, from the 1840s to the Nazi period, the defeat of Germany in the 20th century, this issue was really central. Leslie's approach is very much influenced by the early phase of the German historical school. He mentions Russia. Wilhelm Russia, who is one of the founders of the German historical school, and perhaps the major founder of the German historical school in the 1840s. And Russia and others in the early generation of German historicists put a supreme emphasis on empirical work in a kind of belief that you could, by gathering data, by looking at history closely, one could infer by looking at regularities what those laws were, how things developed, what the principles of evolution were in economic systems. This is a very optimistic view about empirical research. It's the idea that, as some people put it, facts can tell us, or facts speak for themselves. Now, Ingram's emphasis is slightly different because he does point in a few passages to the importance of some theoretical scaffolding around this, which makes him, I think, especially interesting. But he doesn't go full out for this. It starts later in the German historical school in reaction to the Mythildenstreit, which is 1870s, 1880s, when with the engagement, particularly between Schmoller and Karl Menger. And the reactions of Jevons, which you've shown us already, and of Marshall, which we perhaps discuss as well, are actually quite different. But what Jevons does is say, well, look, these people simply want to gather facts, and consequently theory goes in the dustbin. I'm paraphrasing. I mean, it's a kind of dismissive rebuttal. I mean, he doesn't quite put Leslie in the same camp, and he recognizes, perhaps tacitly, Leslie's more sophisticated approach. But he says, if we go down this road, we end up just dumping theory, and we need theory. Now, Marshall's position is quite different. Marshall was much more influenced by the second phase of the German historical school, and those argued for some theory to guide empirical investigation. This came out of the Mythildenstreit, which is after Menger's criticism. Right. So Marshall's position is quite different from that of Jevons in his dismissal. And I think that Leslie, with this perspective, comes out as a kind of transitional figure.
Right, I think so.
One who wants to build on knowledge of history, wants economics not to be simply assume its axioms and then go with them. He wants empirically grounded theory, rather than dismissing theory or relegating theory.
Well, I have just put on the inaugural lecture given by Marshall in 1885 at Cambridge, which is called "The Present Position of Economics," and I think we are going to get to Marshall later on with a bit more detail. But I think there are these one or two remarkable quotes. One is on page 171, which just make the point that you have described, that economists must be greedy for facts. So the empirical side of economics is important, but the economists must not be content with mere facts, right? And as we must be very grateful to the great thinkers of the historical school, I would say maybe historical schools, we must also be suspicious of any direct light that the past, that the facts are said to throw on problems of the present. And Marshall is also very strict and very critical of people who say that facts speak for themselves. He talks about the theorist, which is the most treacherous theorist. That's on page 168, I think, 167. There is an impossibility of learning anything from facts till they are examined and interpreted by reason, right?
Absolutely.
And it teaches us that the most reckless and treacherous of all theorists is who he professes to let facts and figures to speak for themselves, and who keeps in the background the part he has played, perhaps unconsciously, in selecting and grouping them. And I think this part of the argument really never actually lost relevance until today, because the way how we measure economic growth, the way how we measure gender income inequality, there is a sort of a theory running in the background that we do not really take into account when we say that facts speak for themselves.
Yeah. I mean, Marshall's adversary in Cambridge at that time was his principal adversary was a gentleman called William Cunningham,
right?
Who was a Scot, very much influenced by the German historical school.
Yeah.
But he reflected the early generation, the Rocher and others, and the early generation, as I've said, thought that we could get theory out of facts. That we don't do enough empirical work, enough historical work, the theory would emerge from that endeavor. And Marshall, I think quite rightly, says that won't work. A number of other philosophers of science would agree with Marshall at this point. So Marshall was attacking Cunningham, who took this naive view, might say naive empiricism, which I don't think Leslie is as guilty of, but Cunningham was guilty of that. He argued for this, and so many interpreters of Marshall misinterpret Marshall's attack on Cunningham as an attack on the German historical school,
right,
completely, and it's not the case, because Marshall is strongly influenced by the second and third generations of the German historical school.
Right. If we go back to Leslie, I'd still like to look for some similarities between his thinking and, for instance, the thinking of people like Richard Jones or even Malthus. At the end of Leslie's essay on the philosophical method, I think he basically puts his thesis up there when he summarizes the position that every successive stage, the hunting, the pastoral, the agricultural, the commercial stage, has an economy which is connected with the physical, intellectual, moral, and civil development. And the economical condition of English society at this day is the outcome of the entire movement which has evolved the political constitution, the structure of the family, the forms of religion, the learned professions, the arts and sciences, the state of agriculture, manufactures, and commerce. So the method of the political economy must be one which corresponds to that evolution. And I think this is a very profound point that basically reminds us, even until today, that it's very difficult for us to speak about markets in places that have not really developed institutions of property and contract, for instance. And it is very difficult for us to understand the equilibrating mechanisms of the market theories that we have if they apply to societies that have not developed the concepts and the categories that underpin markets. And I think Leslie, for instance, makes a big deal out of the different perception of wealth in different places.
Which is an important point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is this criticism of the a priori and the deductive method, where he criticizes people like Mill and Ricardo.
Yeah.
And I think
Mill and Ricardo are different, actually.
Yeah.
I think Ricardo is more a prioristic.
Absolutely, and we're going to get to John Stuart Mill and the tension within him in a second. But I have this tangent point before we get to Jones and Malthus and the inductivist criticism of the a priori theory. This is still Leslie on page 230, and I wonder what you think about this. Leslie says here that the a priori political economy has sought to deduce the laws which govern the directions of human energies, the division of employments, the modes of production, and the nature, the amount, and the distribution of wealth from an assumption respecting the course of conduct prompted by individual interest. So this is the debate about self-interest, about the sovereignty of individual. But Leslie then says that the germ from which the existing economy of every nation has been evolved is not the individual, still less the mere personification of an abstraction, but the primitive community, a community, one blood in property, thought, moral responsibility, and manner of life. And that individual interest itself and the desires, aims, and pursuits of every man and woman in the nation have been molded by and received their direction and form from the history of that community. And I wonder, can we connect this passage in Leslie to the relationship between Smith's theory of moral sentiments and his Wealth of Nations? Because I think when Smith writes the theory of moral sentiments, he gives us a theory that shows what is the appropriate level and intensity of the individual's own interest, and what is it that a praiseworthy conduct in a given society is. And that basically shows how a society permits an individual to act in a self-interested way. Do you see a connection there between Smith's moral sentiments theory and what Leslie argues here about the relationship of individual and a society?
Absolutely. I think you're pointing to passages which very clearly show an influence of Smith, a continuing influence of Smith. I mean, the trouble is, when we talk about Smith, we have to deal with the fact that he's become celebrated by individualists and free marketeers, whereas in fact he's much more complex, Smith. And as you say, he has notions of community. He has a moral and practical role for the state in his economy, which is emphasized time and time again.
I think the emergent role of the impartial spectator in Smith is really something that Leslie points to in this passage, and I find this fascinating when Leslie points towards the inductive and historicist mind of Adam Smith, because to people who haven't read and studied deeply theory of moral sentiments, this point might be just completely lost there.
Yeah. I mean, it also reminds me of someone who was very much influenced by Smith's theory of moral sentiments, his second great book, written before the Wealth of Nations. It was Darwin. Darwin was not did not celebrate individualism. He saw the evolution of the human species as very much one of group survival, and he read Smith and was influenced by Smith on this point. And what he did was to take Smith's idea of moral sentiments and give it an evolutionary explanation, which he does in The Descent of Man, in a great book published in 1871. And these arguments are neglected. Again, people wrongly see Darwin as an individualist, but in fact, like Smith, he sees the vitality and importance of human social organization and group survival.
Well, these intellectual connections, I really do find them as very, very, very exciting, and the connection of Darwin to these people really also goes through the reasoning of Malthus and his successor Richard Jones, and this is a passage from Jones's preface to his book on political economy. And in that preface, he basically anticipates the point of Leslie and follows on the point of stages of development in people like Smith, arguing that the principles which determine the position and progress and govern the conduct of large bodies of human race placed under different circumstances can be only learned by experience. So again, it is that appeal to experience and historical method. And then he comes out very strongly here, arguing that the economist must be a shallow reasoner who by mere efforts of consciousness, by consulting his own views, feelings, and motives, and the narrow sphere of his personal observation and reasoning a priori, expects that he shall be able to anticipate the conduct, the progress, and fortunes of large bodies of men, differing from himself in moral and physical temperament and influenced by differences, varying in extent and variously combined in climate, soil, religion, education, and government. So, do you think this is really the influence of his work at the East India College here?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think he's carrying the torch from Malthus too.
Yeah.
On this point, because Malthus was a friend but critic of Ricardo.
Yeah.
They were contemporaries, and Malthus tries to criticize the a prioristic bias,
right,
the axiomatic bias of Ricardo's thinking, which still pervades modern economics. Now, assume this, and then let's build a model, and we draw out the logical consequences. And the facts of the matter often don't get much of a look in. So Malthus was criticizing that tendency, which to a degree found in Ricardo, axiomatic a priori method. Yeah. It's not that Malthus abandoned logical thinking and modeling, because his theory of population is a prioristic in its construction and its conclusions.
Jones criticizes, yeah. Jones himself criticizes sort of the dogmatic tendencies of Malthus's population theory, right? So
yeah.
Jones takes from Malthus, but also is critical to the deductivist bent of Malthus.
Yeah.
I have put 3 paragraphs from Malthus's introduction to his book on political economy, and there is this criticism of Ricardo, which is covert, but it is very apparent, that you mentioned. Yeah. Malthus asks, what shall we say of all the questions relating to taxation and various economic laws? The study of laws of nature in all its branches is interesting, but we have to keep in mind that the laws which regulate the movements of human society have an infinitely stronger claim to our attention, because they're not like the physical laws. They relate to objects about which we are daily and hourly conversant, and their effects are continually modified by human interference. I think here comes the criticism of Ricardo, when he continues and says, there are some eminent persons, Ricardo, so strongly attached to the general rules of political economy, that though they are aware that in practice some exceptions to them may occasionally occur, they do not think it wise and politic to notice them, for fear of directing the public attention too much and too frequently to exceptions, and thus weakening the force and utility of the general rules. Do you think the criticism is fair, or is Malthus exaggerating a little bit?
It is largely fair. I think, I mean, Keynes. There's a great quote from Keynes where he says that only if British economics built much more on Malthus than it did on Ricardo. He regretted the fact that the deductive method, a prioristic method, triumphed. This is Keynes speaking in the 20th century, and Keynes points to Malthus as the main opponent at the time of Ricardo's position. So I think it's very much a question of nuance.
Right.
And I would be critical of formulations which say it's only by empirical experience that we learn. Right. It's only by looking at history that we can understand laws of development or whatever. The problem with this is that you don't know what to look at unless you have some kind of theoretical conception or preconception.
Right.
And sometimes Malthus goes too far. And so the nuances are very important.
Right. I think if we go back and then go back to these critics like Malthus and like Jones, we will find that there may be perhaps too much of an appeal to experience and on repeated observations. But also they really call our attention to the fact that societies develop in stages. Different stages deal with different, let's say, intellectual infrastructures, and these different intellectual infrastructures require different conceptual and theoretical framework to understand them. And I think this is a really important point and criticism. The experience of mankind to which they point. But here there is another criticism of Jones towards Ricardo. I think Ricardo really was a punching bag in that sense. Jones writes, and that is on page 23, those who have been the most prominent in circulating the a priori and deductivist error have really turned aside from the task of going through this honest examination. They have confined the observations on which they founded their reasoning to the small portion of the Earth's surface by which they were immediately surrounded, and have then proceeded at once to erect a superstructure of doctrines and opinions, either wholly false or, if partially true, as limited in their application as was the field from which the materials for them were collected. So again, perhaps if Ricardo was in charge of the East India College, maybe his edge would not be as sharp, and then he would be also required to pay attention to some of the conditions which are not the conditions of the upper middle class society developing in London at that time, and maybe he would be required to look at the importance of status as opposed to contract. And I think that criticism is very important and valid there.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And there's another problem which arises here, and that is that if you make the point, which I think carries some force, that the ideas that economists have developed have more applicability to modern market societies and less applicability to, say, India or Ireland at the time of the potato famine, it raises the question: is do those principles, are they adequate for dealing with just a market economy? If we have phases of development and we locate the modern phase, the capitalist economy or the market economy, are those principles adequate? So there's a second line of attack which occurs particularly later with Schmoller and others, where they say that even for a market economy, these principles have some deficiency. So placing everything in historical perspective actually gives you the advantage of seeing not just problems in application to earlier periods, but also to current periods.
Mill hints that some of the assumptions and laws of political economy have historical specific application and might only be applicable to the Anglo-American capitalism. So if we look at his own words here, he says, an English political economist, like his countrymen in general, has seldom learned that it is possible that men, in conducting the business of selling their goods over a counter, should care more about their ease or their vanity than their pecuniary gain. Yet those who know the habits of the continent of Europe are aware how apparently small a motive often outweighs the desire of money-getting, and in the operations which have money-getting for their direct objects. And this is an interesting point, I think, that we maybe wouldn't expect from John Stuart Mill. The more highly the science of mythology is cultivated, and the better the diversities of individual and national character are understood, the smaller probably will the number of propositions become which it will be considered safe to build on as universal principles of human nature. What can we make out of this statement?
I think there's a tension in Mill's thinking here. I think he's influenced not just by some of the historical school writers, but also by Auguste Comte, who's coming to prominence in the 1840s, 1850s, including in the English-speaking world. But of course, Mill was familiar with the French-speaking world as well. And Comte was, again, an exemplar of this ultra-empiricism, which first half of the middle of the 19th century. The idea that you just gather facts and infer theory from them. When Comte was a more sophisticated thinker than I'm suggesting in that brief summary, but Mill was very much influenced. But he later becomes, in search of some kind of theoretical system, he moves away from this Comtean viewpoint.
So let me look at what you're talking about here. A year after this, in 1844, Mill, when writing on the definition and method of the political economy, defines political economy and says, it is the science which traces the laws, and again, this is what the historicists are protesting against, of the phenomena of society as arise from the combined operations of mankind for the production of wealth, insofar as those phenomena are not modified by the pursuit of any object. And in that essay, he then continues saying that the method that we're using to examine political economy, that is going to be an abstract method. So political economy is an abstract science, and the method is going to be the a priori method. And so I think this is the moving away from his early belief that the more we learn about the diversities of people around the world and different stages of development that they're into, the less universal will be our theory. And it seems that indeed he is moving away from that, expressing some of that tension.
But his book, Principles of Political Economy, still reflects an empirical orientation as well as a theoretical one, and also has comparisons of different institutions and systems. He has a quite sizable discussion of socialism, for example, in that book. So he still seems aware, but there is this tension and shift in his thinking. And of course, his later work is it's a shame he didn't write more economics, more political economy.
Right.
In his later work, he turned to other issues, other essays, liberty and so on.
Right. These were, I agree. I think that these were very good essays on social philosophy, informed by his background in political economy. But it is interesting, both in thinkers like Marshall and John Stuart Mill, that although they had these nuanced views, and really for that matter, Adam Smith, what we mostly take from them are things like the abstract and a priori definition of economics, and saying that the science reasons from assumptions, not from facts, and the supposition, the presupposition, an arbitrary definition of man as being who invariably does that by which he may obtain the greatest amount of necessaries, conveniences, luxuries, with the smallest quantity of labor and physical self-denial. So this is basically the early definition and statement of the economic man that is so much vilified. And the fact that political economy reasons from assumed premises which might be totally without foundation in fact, and which are not pretended to be universally in accordance with. It is interesting that we take these statements from Mill, and also then later on we're going to see that the historicist tendencies of Marshall are just basically neglected and then forgotten, and what we get is not a very nuanced view of these thinkers. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I'd like to focus on one particular factor in Mill, and where he has, for good or ill, been very influential, and that is his use of utilitarianism.
Right.
Because what Mill does, not so much in his political economy book, but in his writings on utilitarianism, is actually take on board the Benthamite view of utility maximization, and he's seen as very much as a transitional figure by some historians of economic thought between the classical theory of value based on labor and its various versions, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, and the modern theory of value in modern neoclassical economics, which is utility-based.
Yeah.
But here again, there's complications with Mill, because Mill embraced Bentham. He read Bentham when he was a young man and was besotted by the logic of the argument. His father knew Bentham personally. But he then adds nuance and complication and qualification, and he ends up some distance from utilitarianism. But what happens is what proves influential for Mill on other economists is the raw utilitarian construct of the utility maximizing individual, and all the nuances are forgotten in Mill's own thinking. So it's very much the same with this treatment of historical specificity in Mill. The emphasis on abstract principles is focused upon, and the neglect of the qualifications by modern economists. So Mill is an eclectic figure. He's also a figure that evolves. I admire people whose thinking moves through time, who develops in response to argument and discussion. Mill in some ways evolves positively. In other ways, you can question the direction of his thinking, but nevertheless he changes his emphasis. But these two things became influential: his champion, his adoption of utility maximization, and his greater emphasis on a priori thinking. And these were taken more than any other into the current of mainstream economics as it developed in the second half of the 19th century.
That's right. I also find it quite interesting that the book on really philosophy of science that Mill writes in 1843, The System of Logic, that's really his first big treatise that he publishes. And many people would actually think that what comes out a year after that, in 1844, essays on some unsettled question, that this is really the work of young Mill, which is indoctrinated by Ricardo, by Bentham, by his father, James Mill. But it is clear that young Mill in 1843 or 1844 already had a mind of his own. And it is quite interesting that in his writing on philosophy of science, he is very anti-Ricardo by saying that the more we study the science of ethology, the less universal our laws will be. And I find it quite fascinating that the development in Mill that you mentioned is not really unidirectional. It sort of goes in waves, up and down, and he questioned his position from different angles, and this is quite interesting.
Yes.
Well, is there anything else to be added to the tension in John Stuart Mill before we move on to Marshall?
Yeah, I mean, talking about the logic, it's a great book, a very important book. But there's passages in the logic where he celebrates or underlines a kind of individualistic ontology, and he hints at the possibility of emergent properties in some passages. You could have a chemical association, if I remember correctly. But this was seen as inadequate by some later thinkers who pioneered the concept of emergent properties, and the general idea that you cannot understand economic and social phenomena simply in terms of the attributes of individuals, which is something that Smith seemed to propose. And so again, we find bits of Mill which connect with modern mainstream economics, the emphasis on some kind of ontological individualism,
right?
And other bits of it which are qualified. You raised this critique of Ricardo in the same book. So again, there's cross currents and tensions going on in Mill all the time.
I think what you also mentioned in your book is that Mill basically foreshadows the approach not only of Alfred Marshall but also Frank Knight to some extent. And I wonder, do you consider Frank Knight to be institutionalist in that sense, and why would that be?
I think my definition of institutionalist would be someone concerned about institutions.
Right.
And although Frank Knight, who is a 20th century figure and based in Chicago, was not seen as part of the movement in academia at the time in the United States, which called itself institutionalist. He was very much concerned with institutional issues and debated with leading institutionalists, including Clarence Ayres and others. His letters or correspondence can show that he was very much engaged He was seen as being an outsider, a maverick. I think Buchanan called him a maverick institutionalist. And one of the important things about Knight is he, first of all, he understood and accepted the problem of historical specificity. The best statement I know of that from him is in the second edition of the Risk, Uncertainty and Profit. There's a long preface where he talks about this. He was fluent in German. He read the German speakers, German writers, and German historical school in particular. He translated Weber. So the influence of this German current of thinking was very strong on Knight. And also, like Mill and others, like Malthus, Knight emphasized the importance of moral reasoning and moral thinking and moral motivation in human agents. And he argued against the view that we do still regrettably find in economics that you can reduce everything to some utilitarian calculus or some welfare function.
Right.
There's irreducible moral principles that cannot be treated in this way, which we have to take on board.
I do also find this connection quite fascinating, and although few people think of Knight as being an institutionalist, I think he himself wouldn't really consider himself to be in the same group like Thorsten Veblen, for instance. But the way how Knight thinks about institutions show really this clear connection to the prediction of John Stuart Mill that the more we learn about the differences between people and their historical specificities, the less universal will our economic theory be. And I think Lionel Robbins, whom you mentioned, basically reduced the only universal postulate that economics can put forward as the idea that economics is a science of choice under constraints. And that's the only universal thing that we can basically say. But how these constraints are actually materialized and how choice is being understood, that is very historically specific, and I think Knight understands that. I have a couple of quotes from Knight where he makes that clear, and I think there is this clear link between the thinking of Knight and people like Robbins in the 20th century, where Knight would say that the problem of life is to utilize resources economically to make them go as far as possible in the production of desired results. And the general theory of economics is therefore simply the rationale of life. But the first question in regard to scientific economics is this question of how far life is rational and how far its problems reduce to the form of using given means to achieve given ends. And he's quite skeptical. He would say not very far, in fact. And if we want to get further, institutions really may determine the alternatives of choice and fix the limits of freedom of choice. But the general laws in themselves are universal. These general laws of choice among competing motives are not institutional. They are universal. They're the general laws of production and consumption which hold good whatever specific things are thought of as wealth and whatever productive factors and processes are in use. So I think this is a fascinating separation that we have on the one hand side, the laws of economics, which are never institutional, but also the context around these laws, which has to be understood. And these laws of economics may often relate to institutional situations. So the problems like rational economic behavior, the presence of alternatives of choice between different means arriving at ends, a large part of the extant body of economic theory would be as valid in socialist society as it is in one organized through exchange between individuals. But I think that it is often not really understood very well that Knight put really strong emphasis on that institutional and historical environment that embeds these economic laws. And again, I do see this connection between John Stuart Mill's prediction that the more we learn about ethology, the more restrictive will have to be our attempt to make economic laws universal in that sense.
Yes, that's right. And again, the points you raise about Knight again show the influence of the German historical school. For example, over the limits of rationality.
Right.
It was an issue discussed by Schmoller and several others, Sombart, and they talked about different kinds of motivation, and the focus on rational deliberation was just one aspect of human action. This is also reflected in a particular way in Weber's writing as well. Max Weber, who was actually really part of the German historical school, he was now called a sociologist, but at the time he was not called a sociologist. He was seen as part of this broad stream of thinking that we've been talking about.
So these are the connections that you make in your book on how economists forgot history, and it seems quite interesting and puzzling that there are these worries or preoccupations, strong interest in the problem of historical specificity in many authors that are generally considered to be promoting the, let's say, deductive and often a priori, as some of the 19th century critics of political economy call it, that deductive a priori nature of economics or political economy. And one of those people would, of course, be Alfred Marshall, the person who established the economic program at Cambridge, that was anything but historicist, right? There was this quite a strong and nasty feud between Marshall and people like Cunningham at Cambridge. Can you tell us something more about that?
Yes, I mean, Marshall was the great synthesizer of what we now call neoclassical economics.
Yeah.
And he developed a particular variant of neoclassical economics, which is called partial equilibrium theory. Leon Walras had developed the idea of general equilibrium theory earlier in the 1870s. This wasn't really taken up until the 1940s in modern economics. So Marshall's period from the publication of his principles in 1890 up until roughly the 1940s was 50 years of the dominance of partial equilibrium analysis.
Right.
And the way Marshall reasoned was, we have, of course, he said, we must take account of culture, circumstances, different kinds of motivation. But what we have to do is organize all these insights and evidence, bits of evidence, in terms of some framework, which was partial equilibrium, which actually is more amenable to the addition of institutional data, institutional considerations, cultural issues, different motivations, than is general equilibrium. General equilibrium is the grand theory of everything in economics, as attempted originally by Walras, but also Arrow, de Barreau, and many others in the post-war period. Marshall's framework was more amenable to the kind of evidence and insight and psychological research that people talked about. So he was against this trend. He talks, even in the principles, of the importance of ethics, importance of different kinds of motivation, tradition. It's not all a rational calculus of values and so on. He's very eclectic in that sense. But that gets lost as partial equilibrium becomes encoded in textbooks and taught on teaching programs. The supply and demand framework becomes the dominant set of ideas, and the flexibility and possibility of the Marshallian framework being used in a more eclectic way is gradually lost. Incidentally, we mentioned the American institutionalists and Frank Knight as being a maverick or outsider of this movement. With the possible exception of Veblen, I'd emphasize possible, most of the American institutionalists were also Marshallians.
Right.
And what they tried to do was to run with this hint in Marshall, more than a hint, of the importance of specific circumstances. And Marshall says, yes, I accept that. So they said, well, we must give this more weight, more emphasis. But they didn't throw the Marshallian framework completely overboard. They said we must make it more dynamic. We must make it more flexible. We must make it adjust to circumstances as they evolve and so on. We must recognize the importance of institutions, recognize the importance of technology. And these are points also made by Knight as well. So, but it was common to all institutionalists, again with the possible exception of Veblen, that they did this. Mitchell defended a Marshallian approach. many others like Copeland, all these leading institutionalists, Commons too, accepted a kind of supply and demand analysis, and that was the position of the mainstream position even of American institutionalism.
Right, until quite late on, it seems that recognizing and taking account of the problem of historical specificity is not something that would qualify someone as being marginal or heterodox. It seems to be really connected to the main line since really Adam Smith, through people like Malthus, but also most importantly then John Stuart Mill, up until Alfred Marshall, who basically provides the textbook for many economists until the first half of the 20th century, as you mentioned. And what we find there is this, well, this is the inaugural address that he presents in 1885 at Cambridge. But he makes exactly this point, that man is the great measure of and the creature of circumstances and changes with those circumstances. And this is on page 153. And when we move on to 154, he makes exactly the same point that Malthus made earlier on in the 19th century, that when we look at the mathematical physical sciences that have been growing in importance at the beginning of the 19th century, they might widely differ from one another, but they have one point in common, that their subject matter is constant and unchanged. And the progress of science, familiar to man's mind, but the development of the subject matter of science, that might be strange really, because there is just one matter, one subject matter of science. But there is this inspiration with biology, as the century wore on the biological group of sciences, so maybe he has Darwin in mind. They were slowly making their way, and people were getting clear ideas as to the nature of organic growth. They were learning that if the subject matter of science passes through different stages of development, the laws which apply to one stage will seldom apply without modification to others. So the laws of the science must have a development corresponding to that of the things which they treat. And I think this is really a fascinating statement by one of the most prominent representatives of political economy and the transitional figure between political economy and economics, which has really influenced the development of economics well until the 20th century. But I think this is a point that you make, and you also bring this up in your book, that not many people would actually connect Marshall with this sentence. Not many people would actually guess that this is something that Marshall would, that this is a position that Marshall would defend. Would you not say that the fact that we have forgotten the historicist and institutionalist bent of Marshall, would you not say that this is partially also his own responsibility in some sense?
Well, I think responsibility of everyone. I mean, I'm teaching this. I mean, you're teaching a course on the history of economic thought,
right?
And I think your students are very fortunate. I was taught the history of economic thought at Manchester, and I didn't hear any of this stuff.
Right.
I mean, the whole concentration was on another important topic. The central theme was value and distribution, and
right.
It was a way of understanding the history of economic thought, a thread connecting Smith's right through to modern economics, but over 200 years or so, was theories of value and distribution.
Right.
So I'm not criticizing my teachers, but I think that we have to face choices, and history of economic thought is something which is often pushed off the curriculum. So your students are doubly lucky here to have a chance to look at this, but also the attention you're giving to this particular methodological issue, which was indeed central to economics for 200 years, this discussion. It goes back clearly to Smith and to Malthus and these other thinkers, and persists to the present day. It's kind of forgotten. So we all have a responsibility here, I think, to bring it on. I mean, the problem is how. I mean, because the search for generality, the search for a theory which does everything or does a huge amount and is admired for that reason, mean, generalization is an important thrust of science, but we find overgeneralization not just in economics. We find it in sociology too. Part of I've written a bit of this in the book about the way sociology also began to chase this will-o'-the-wisp of a super general theory, which will cover everything, and lost sight of historically specific circumstances and the need to make theory sensitive to historical change and different phases of development. So it's a big job to get this back on the agenda.
Yeah.
And that's why I think people like Knight are important. You can agree or disagree with parts of his views, but he had a clear understanding of this as an important mid 20th century influential economist. Marshall also has to be revisited, and Mill likewise, as we discussed. So how do we do that?
I'm not sure if there is not a little bit of soft pedaling in Alfred Marshall's inaugural address, and if he's simply not being polite to the German historical school, saying that, yes, we recognize that these people are being very important. We recognize that historical specificity is an important problem. But when I was asking about the responsibility of Marshall for why economists might be forgetting history, I'm wondering whether the way how Marshall sets up the economics tripos at Cambridge is then not really contradicting the fact that he's saying that historical specificity is central when we study economics.
Yes, I've wondered about that point. There's some accounts of that period, of the development of the tripos and its early years, up to Marshall's retirement and afterwards, where Pigou takes his chair.
Right.
Some of those say that play Marshall as a schemer who was trying to impose this highly theoretical or theory-driven version of economics and displace the historical approaches. I'm not convinced by that argument at all. The evidence I would give would be that Marshall does, in the inaugural address, understand or recognize explicitly, and I think they have to believe him, the importance of empirical research and history. But there's only one chair being set up. So he's saying we can't do anything without some kind of theory. We have to develop a system of ideas. And indeed, some of the basic ideas of neoclassical economics were foreshadowed by the German historical school. It's not as if he's contradicting them. Some of the developments of marginalist principles were in historical school writers and theories of price and so on. Rudimentary developments were taking place in Germany within the umbrella of the historical school. And he doesn't abandon the 1885 position in the principles either, because there's several references in the principle to German writers in the school, and particularly to Schmuller.
Right.
And he quotes Schmuller as, we need induction and deduction, as we require two legs for walking.
That's right.
Early pages of the principles, directly quoting Schmuller, directly countering a single emphasis on either of those two parts of the story. And this, of course, inspires John Neville Keynes, Maynard Keynes' father, to write his famous methodology text at the turn of the century. And of course, Marshall knew him personally at Cambridge as well. And then another factor to take into account is there's two issues. One is who becomes Marshall's successor, and then what happens subsequently in the department. Remember, there's only one chair, small number of students. Theory is said to be important, so the teaching of theory is on the curriculum, on the tripos. He then appoints Pigou. Now, some people will say, well, this is a conspiracy to, subvert the historical school, to appoint this ultra-theoretical neoclassical economist who became one of the pioneers of welfare economics. Well, if you look at the CVs of the contenders at the time, And Pico was one of the youngest, he was in his 30s.
Yes.
But there's simply no doubt about it at all. That Pico was supremely qualified. He'd written brilliant work, not just on neoclassical economics, on evolution, on Darwinism, and all this stuff, published in the Economic Journal.
Yeah.
In top journals. He was far ahead. He was an enormously creative person, as he proved to be when he became installed as chair. And then after the First World War, Cambridge finds enough money to appoint a second chair. And what's this chair in? It's in economic history. So there's a chair of theory and there's a chair of economic history, and that's Clapham.
Right.
It takes that position in the 20s. So once the money is found for a second chair, the Marshall's desire to balance theory with economic history and facts and empirics is realized. Of course, I'm not sure what role he played in that decision. He was already well retired, and but by that time that those appointments took place. But certainly Pigot reflected his mentor's preference in that respect. So I think the idea of Marshall as a devious conspiracist doesn't hold water. Of course, nobody's perfect, and everyone has personality flaws. But I don't think Marshall is the demon some people paint him.
I think it also points to the way how we exaggerate the importance of, let's say, individual design or individual intent. The role of individuals really in science. I think that the story that we see here also calls us to pay much more attention to the importance of the contexts and of the collective and of the groups within which these economists exist. And so I think in that sense, even within the Republic of Science, so to speak, there is a great deal of unintended consequences that keep happening sort of independently of the intentions and designs of the people who write and develop these theories.
Absolutely. Yes, I mean, your phrase Republic of Science refers to a great theorist of that, Michael Blangy.
Yeah.
Who wrote this brilliant essay in 1962 about science being a social process.
Yeah.
And it very much is so. And it's also becoming, with Marshall, it's becoming professionalized and internationalized at the same time.
Right.
It's already international because a lot of the leading late 19th century economists went to Germany to study, including Marshall himself. He visited Germany on a couple of occasions and studied there. And others, including leading American economists, like Richard Ely and Commons and others, also either went to Germany or learned German or influenced by German writing. So you get this internationalization going on. And also the professionalization of economics, the formation of economics degrees, economics departments, appointment to professors. And these, as you just have a logic of their own. They involve people who are interacting with each other under institutional constraints with common cultures and ways of thinking and groupthink, and we're constantly compromising and adjusting as we do in everyday life when we deal with people in these circumstances, in economics departments, in business schools, in families, in other organizations. This is the stuff of life. We just compromise, deal with, have conversation. We have dispute. And the whole process is deeply social.
Right.
So I absolutely agree with you. It's not entirely a matter of design or scheming, no matter how powerful the individual may be in given circumstances.
Right. Well, Jeff, thank you very much for your time. This has been really great discussion. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you for writing this book because it makes my work much easier in teaching history of economic thought, and also your work in general on institutionalism and evolutionary economics has really greatly contributed to my understanding of matters. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. A great pleasure for me too.